I've got plenty to
On March 16th, 1621, they were out building, and a Native American walks into the village. His name was Samoset, and he boldly says, "Welcome, Englishmen," in English. And he tells them that he's from a tribe of Indians, which were Abenaki in what is now Maine, and that the place they were settling was called Patuxent.
Before I begin, I want to tell you 3 things I believe about history. I believe that history should be studied and appreciated for its accuracy, whether it's romantic or unromantic. I believe that history should never be erased because it's ugly. We should learn from the bad and then build on what's good. And thirdly, I am a social historian. I love to hear the stories. I love to know where they came from. I want to know how the people interacted and reacted with each other. So today I'm going to tell you a story that you've probably heard 100 times. But one of my social things is that I love the women of the Mayflower. So I'm going to tell you this with an emphasis on the women of the Mayflower. As you and I were both taught, these were probably people that came and dressed in black and white clothes. I thought that they were quiet, keep your head down, subservient to their husband, had no voice, were preached to all day long Sunday, and I hope today to dispel some of that. The first thing I learned, and you all will learn if you become a social historian, is that you can never put your today values and thoughts into who they are. You have to understand their background, and you have to understand their way they were raised. These people were raised on medieval traditions. They were raised at a time when Shakespeare was infused to their lives. They believed in folklores and witches and festivals, seasonal festivals, and that's how they were brought up. So now we're looking as they're growing up. And the Roman Catholic Church is split. The Church of England is the now church. And the king was deciding that everyone would believe like he believed, and he would tell you how you should believe and how you should act. Well, within the Church of England, there was a group of people called Puritans who wanted to change some of these rules, but they wanted to do it from within the church. Within this group of Puritans, there were a group of people called the Separatists, and those are Mayflower Pilgrims. Mayflower, just what it means. They wanted to separate. They wanted to do nothing with the church. They believed that if it didn't have biblical justification, then we should not believe it. These Separatists used a Bible that was published in 1599, and I tried to get a picture of it for you, but I never could get a close one. This Bible was one of the first that had the numbered chapters and verses, and in the side were notations down in the margins, and those notations were written by Reformation leaders like John Knox and John Calvin. Well, as you can imagine, King James did not like this Bible. because he thought the little notes in the column might be seditious or talking against his authority, and he probably wasn't wrong. So further printings, which the Mayflower people did, separatist, that got out and around. There was a real battle between King James, and soon they were being arrested, not being allowed, and they realized we have to leave if we're going to believe like we think we should. So their minister, their pastor, was a man named John Robinson. He was very active in a university in Leiden, and so he went to Leiden when with some of his work, and he decided that this would be a good place because it was considered free at that time, and you could come. So he made arrangements for these separatists to be able to come, and man, woman, and child to Leiden. The deal was you could come to Leiden, and you could believe like you wanted, but every man, woman, and child was required to work. But they came because they wanted their religious freedom, even though these jobs were generally menial jobs. Now, at that time, Leiden is one of the biggest trade areas. There's a university. It's exciting. It is a time of enlightenment and free thinking. And so you add all of those things with the medieval past, so you're getting kind of a picture of who these people are. To add further to this little combination and recipe, the separatists believe in prophesizing, not prophesizing like telling the future, but they believe that the application of biblical passages to the problem of understanding the Bible and how it related to current events was a gift from God, and it was a gift to the faithful. So, for example, if you chose to criticize the government because it was going against the Bible teachings, then that was considered prophetic from God. He gave you those ideas. We have several writings, not all, but several writings. And Winthrop, who was a pilgrim, gave us one, and he gave us a little snippet of what a church service was like. It would start with a little mini sermon, then there would be a reading of the text, then there would be the prophesizing, then there would be an exposition of the prophesizing and people talking about the spiritual application of it, and then much of the service was done with the congregation discussing this. It was totally different from what I believed their services was like. But one of the most interesting facts is the fact that women were believed to have been bestowed these gifts from God as well as men, and they had an obligation to speak what they thought. And we learned this from everybody was supposed to talk. I thought there was one preacher. John Robinson wrote, "Into the fellowship of that work are to be admitted not only the ministers and the teachers, but also the elders and the deacons, yea, even the multitude, which are willing to confer their gift received of God to the common utility of the church." But later he was quoting one of his prophetic reckonings, and he actually was talking about how Paul might not have had it right. And he wrote, it seems most plain that Paul hath no eye nor respect at all of these extraordinary gifts and endowments of prophecy, authorizing even women furnished with them to speak publicly and in the presence of men, as it appears in the Bible with Miriam, Huldah, Anna, as also even Jezebel herself in regard to order and others. So now I see that these women have respect. They are encouraged to talk. Women should, in the Separatists, women should obey, and they are thought of as God's gift to man. Before you men get all excited, you had an obligation as well, and that was to love her and work in harmony with her. Please note that word harmony, because you will hear it over and over in the passages, especially from John Robinson. So now I see these women, they're not just sitting around visiting, they're not just doing chores all day, but they're probably speaking openly about religion and what they think is doing right and wrong. And thanks to this book, which is called Strangers and Pilgrims, Travelers and Sojourners, is by Jeremy Bang. And Jeremy Bangs is known as probably one of the utmost experts on our American Mayflower pilgrims. But he's also the director of the Leiden American Pilgrim Museum. Thanks to him, we have many documents found in the courts of Leiden. We do know that most of the women could read. We don't know for sure if they could write, but thanks to Jeremy Bang's records, we did find a court record, because normally when they married, women married around 20, they're in the court records, it has Dorothy May coming to the court with her father. She is 16 years old, and he is giving her permission to marry William Bradford, and she does sign her own name in that court document. William Bradford was 20. So reading more about these services and my interpretation that they were to sit with their heads down, it was totally against what I believed. Actually, the writings say that you are not to keep your eyes down, because that would be too much like reading from man-made, the Book of Prayers, Common Book of Prayers. But rather, you were to keep your heads held high, lift your arms to heaven, and your eyes on God. That's just not what I visioned. So this tendency of the Pilgrim Church, especially to recognize that women had the right to vote, women had the right to speak, and they had the right to voice an opinion and talk about religion, and just had a little more than what I thought. But also, it did run contrary to the time. The English law usually said that when a man marries a woman, he gets ownership of all the property that she might inherit. But thanks to Jeremy Bang, we have several documents that show where the men of the Mayflower gave their wives their power of attorney, and they were able to go to wherever they needed to and tend to their own businesses and dispose or deal with their inherited property as they saw fit. When Richard Warren left his wife behind, he came on the Mayflower. She must have been a very astute businesswoman, and she took care of much of his affairs. When she finally came to Plymouth, we have records where after she became a widow, she paid the taxes as the head of household, and eventually became an independent agent in her own right. So now I'm seeing these women changing. They're not in the background women. These families that stayed in Holland stayed 12 years, and they lived together, and it was close. But you have to also remember that while they were living there, so was young Rembrandt. So were the Adams. Our presidents, John and Quincy, lived right down the street. It was such an exciting time. But they finally realized that their children and them can never get any better. They never raise their stature. They would always have these jobs in there. Plus, the Dutch and the Spanish had a treaty fixing to expire, and there was talk of war. But one of the biggest reasons they wanted to leave was the Dutch were a little freer than the English, and they were fiercely English. And they were afraid that their children were losing their English heritage. So they felt like they had nothing really to lose. And the bond they had was so tight together. Many of these women were related, many were closer than sisters. They were dependent on each other, both in Holland and England, Holland and forevermore, on their needs. But they finally realized they needed to leave. So William Bradford wrote that they met, and the Pilgrims were worried about the weak bodies of the women and whether they would be able to make this transatlantic voyage and the construction of a new colony. And you also have to remember too, at this time there was just Roanoke. That was 1587, and there were 17 women that went on that, but as far as the Mayflower knew, that was a very scary, strange part, because Roanoke, as we know, didn't fare well. And then in 1607 there was Jamestown, but even at this time when the Pilgrims were thinking about leaving, there were very, very few women that had taken up residence there. But these women believed it was their duty to follow their husbands. I told you before, Richard Warren chose to leave his wife behind, as did many others. Many of them, and the wives were coming, as Dorothy May, and William Bradford now had a 2-year-old. Her family was there, and she was close to them, so she left her 2-year-old. Many of the families split up, leaving some children there and some on the trip. I thought it was very interesting that they often chose the younger children that needed more tending than usual. But whatever the choice, that had to bond the women even closer with compassion. Both of them worrying, did I make the right decision to leave my children? Did I make the right decision to bring my children? Whatever the choice, the voyage began. 2 ships were bound for the America, the Speedwell and the Mayflower. The really short version here is they set out twice, but the Speedwell had many problems, leaks and things. So it was determined that some families would move to the Mayflower, some would get off, But by this time, the date they were going to leave is almost 4 weeks. They've lived on this boat almost 4 weeks and haven't left. It also put them in danger because the travel time was now a month later, and they needed the waters to be what they had planned for the smoother sailing. On September 16th, 1620, the Mayflower sailed. The passengers of the Mayflower consisted of 50 men, 19 women, 3 of them in their 3rd trimester. That would be Elizabeth Hopkins, Susanna White, and Mary Allerton. So remember when I told you that you couldn't put your current day's feelings into it? My 3rd trimester, all I wanted to eat was hot sauce. And I was extremely sensitive to smells. So when I told my husband this story, he goes, "I love you, baby, but I don't think you would have made it." I cannot imagine being that late in your pregnancy and taking this journey. Also on the trip, there were 14 young adults, 5 of them girls nearing marriageable age. There were 19 children for a total of 102. But wait, there was also a Mastiff and an English Springer Spaniel. So add 2 dogs to those smells. That's incredible. The Mayflower came to anchor in Provincetown Harbor on November 11th, 1620, after 66 days at sea. Before they left, John Robinson, their pastor, said, "You're going to meet and you're going to be on this boat with many different kinds of people." Well, most of the people that came with the Pilgrims were not, all of them were not separatists, but they were sympathetic. But he was saying, you're going to meet new, crew. You're going to meet these new Native Americans. You may meet other people. And this is very important. He said it is very important that you follow their faithful teachings that you know and strive for harmony. Well, that day, that is exactly what they did. They decided they knew they weren't where they were supposed to be. They were supposed to be in Virginia. But here were these groups of men, women, and they were starting on a new adventure. And so they started the Mayflower Compact. And I think we have a little screen of the Mayflower Compact. This is an amazing document. It's often referred to as the cornerstone of our Declaration of Independence, and John Adams referred to it as the foundation of our U.S. Constitution. But these men signed this, and this document provided much of the things we know today: religious freedom, the right to own your own land, to benefit financially from your own hard work, and a government by the consent of the governed. It was amazing, and it's very important to our society is that people understand that this is the basis of the U.S. Constitution, the Declaration. No woman died on the voyage. The babies. One baby was born on the voyage across in the Atlantic, Oceanus Hopkins. Perfect name. Unfortunately, died a few days later. Then while they were anchored at Cape Cod Harbor, Peregrine White was born. And on December 22nd, 1620, Mary Allerton gave birth to a stillborn child. Mary Bradford was the first woman to die and the only woman to die in the month of December. She accidentally fell off the ship and fell into the cold, frigid waters below. There have been a lot of movies made that say that she jumped and committed suicide. And this has been researched. The only comment Bradford wrote was that she died. If you remember the story that Tom told us at the beginning, on the way over, Stephen Hopkins got John Howland got cabin fever and goes up, and it's very slippery, and he falls off the boat and is only saved. But that shows you it's slippery. It was a gale, I'll give him that, but we know it's slippery, and it could very well have been once she fell into that water and her woolen clothes would have drug her down so far, so quickly. Anyway, the Mayflower remained in New England with the colonists because they were supposed to go back, but they stayed through that first terrible winter that gave some shelter. It was cold and damp and unheated, but nevertheless, it was some shelter. They were still exposed to malnutrition and just exposure. Scurvy was a big problem, and it was causing their teeth to rot, and their many teeth lost during that time. No woman at the lowest ebb of this time, many got sick. But at the lowest ebb of the Mayflower Pilgrims, there were only 7 people well enough to tend to the sick. So while no woman died during the Mayflower voyage, life after the arrival proved to be very, very difficult. In fact, 78% of the women would die the first winter, a far higher percentage than for the men and children. We do not have the dates of all the women, but we do know that Rose Standish died on January 29th, and Mary Allerton died on February 25th, and Elizabeth Winslow died on March 24th. Most of the women died in February and March. And when they died, because we did not want the Native Americans to know how weak they were, the bodies were taken and buried at night. And this broke my heart. As many of you know, during this pandemic, we lost someone, we couldn't show them the proper burial. And it doesn't take the stress or the loss away. And it was same for them. They could not go and give them a proper burial. And then I found out that it was not part of the Separatist beliefs. Funeral service were to be almost as if there was no ceremony. There wouldn't have been the prayers for the dead, because that would have been too much of the man-made rules. It was supposed to be respectful and put in the ground respectfully, but there was no ceremony or service. So that made me feel a little better, and yet the loss had to be excruciating. So I just can't help but feel that this is such a testament to their strength and to their faith. This 78% compares with the 40% of the Plymouth men and 16% of the children at a time when generally under normal circumstances, the children's mortality rate was higher. There's several reasons for this. One being that the women were not allowed to get out and roam around. Men were building the homes, so there was no one to protect them. They had to remain in the ship. They were constantly living in the exposure to the illnesses and things. It is presumed that many of them were nearly starving to death to give their kids the food. They did not have fresh water to drink, and their beer, which they only brought beer because the Dutch water and the English water wasn't any good. Versus the men, even though they were out in the fresh air, felling trees, drinking the fresh New England water, which they found. It was so horrible that only 5 of the 19 women survived that first winter. If you look at this chart over here, it's a very impactful chart. Only 5 of the 19 women survived the first winter. One of those was Catherine Carver, and she died in May. And we do have Bradford's notes on that, and it says that she died of a broken heart, her husband having had a stroke 1 month before. So weak bodies or not, after the first winter and by the time of the first Thanksgiving, there were only 4 women left to care for the colony's 50 men and children. That poster breaks your heart. The 4 women were Eleanor Billington, Elizabeth Hopkins, Mary Brewster, and Susanna White, who is now Susanna White Winslow, because Susanna Winslow was the widow of William White, who died the first winter. And she married Edward Winslow, whose wife Elizabeth had also died that first winter. We went to Plymouth Plantation, my first visit to Plymouth Plantation, and one of the reenactors was reenacting William White, and one of the spectators said, "How lucky it is that you found love so quick." And he looked at her sort of bewildered, and he said, "It has nothing to do with love. It has to do with survival." And what an interesting thing. So all of that being said, from March to September, crops were planted with the help of Squanto. A peace treaty was made with the sachem or chief, Massasoit, and chief of the Wampanoag Indian tribe. And there were truly many things to be thankful for. But the Separatists, once the Puritans and Separatists both got rid of the medieval ecclesiastic calendar, holidays like Easter and Christmas and Saints' Days were no longer. In fact, they only had 3 basic religious holidays: the Sabbath, the Day of Humiliation and Fasting, and the Day of Thanksgiving and Praise. But that day was reserved only for when God proven to them that they were doing the right thing. The first time it was done was in 1623, when God sent a rainstorm that saved their crops. So Thanksgiving was not a religious ceremony. I used to have a children's book. I probably threw it away because it was so inaccurate. But you'd read through it and it said, and the Mayflower women said, "Let's have a party." I don't think the Mayflower women said that, but I no longer own that book. Because there were 4 married women, Eleanor Billington, Mary Brewster, Elizabeth Hopkins, and Susanna White Winslow. There were 5 adolescent girls. That would be Mary Chilton, who's 14, Constance Hopkins, who was around 13 or 14, Pricilla Mullins, she was 19, Elizabeth Tilley, who was 14 or 15, and we don't know her name, but the Carvers had a maidservant that was about 18 or 19. You have to remember, not all of these women were poor. They had come from some fairly good backgrounds. Many had servants, and they also had, which we all think about today, they had medical care in England and in Holland. But here they are on their own. So they decided they would have a feast, and we have word that from another book where we get some records called Mort's Relations, and it says that a harvest being gotten in, our governor sent 4 men on fowling, so we might have a special manner of rejoice together. So it was not a religious feast, but it was a special manner of rejoice. To this meeting, to this festival or rejoicing time of celebration, Massasoit was invited, but they didn't realize that he was going to bring 90 people with him. I'm sure you know how women just love unexpected company for dinner. But 90 came. They did bring 4 deer. And at this Thanksgiving festival, they played games. The men had races and target practice and things like that. But they feasted for 3 days. And this was wonderful. Food was plentiful, but it also decreased their surplus and could be found. But now we have, it was a great time. Everybody had a good time and things settled for a few weeks. The houses has been built. I believe there were seven houses at that time. And in these houses, which are probably the size of a bedroom in your home, not the owner's suite, but the bedroom, maybe smaller even than that, would be a family. It would have several orphans in the homes, and there was probably a single man. Some of the houses housed only men, but they were built, and it had been a good time. And less than 3 weeks later, the next set of colonists came on a boat called the Fortune. There were 36 people, 32 men, 3 women, and 1 daughter. And I'm sure they were they were welcomed. But unfortunately, they came with little provisions. So, and there was not time to do the housing. So now you imagine the 7 houses and all of the people that are in them, and now we have 36 new people. Records indicate that most of the women that were left behind survived. Miriam came later, but they survived. So the question remains, should these women of weak bodies have made the voyage or not? In my opinion, if they hadn't made the voyage, the colony wouldn't have survived. In Plymouth, there are 2 statues, and I believe we have pictures of those. One of them is called the Pilgrims' mother statue, And it reads, "They brought up their families in sturdy virtue and a living faith in God, without which nations perish." And the other is called the Maiden, the Pilgrim Maiden, and it was dedicated in 1924 to those intrepid English women whose courage, fortitude, and devotion brought a new nation into being. So today, when you think about women power, think about these wonderful, strong, courageous women of the Mayflower. So I hope you learned something from that. I'd like to tell you a little bit about our book. The Texas Society of Mayflower Descendants wanted some way to commemorate this 400th. And if you are from Texas, you almost always get, how did a pilgrim get here? Well, we decided to tell the story of our Pilgrims' ancestors and how they came to Texas. This turned out so interesting. Many people wrote, and it ends up being a history book. 2 of our members came with Austin's Old 300. There are 2 Alamo defenders that we found out about. They came for historical reasons. One story, they were captured by the Confederate, but released in Galveston, and he loved Galveston, so he went back and got his family and brought him here. Just incredible stories. We have one editor that said, with a very big English background, and she said, "This book was driving me crazy because every story is different." And she said, and then I realized that I could hear all of the members' voices. For some, it was the history. For some, it was the journey of finding that ancestor. So we left everything in. You get a little of both. If you would like a copy of this book, it can be found on Lulu.com. You can type in the book's name, or you can put in one of the publishers. And then I believe we have that on the web page too. If you are interested in joining the Texas Society of Mayflower Descendants, look us up on our web page, which is on this screen. Or if you just want to be friends with us, join us on Facebook. It is a wonderful group of people, and we're so proud. And thank you so much for allowing me to share my passion with you. Jim is going to talk now.
One of the things that is important for our celebration is sort of encourage reenactment and dressing appropriately if you're a Mayflower ancestor. And there's also ways to tell the story of the Pilgrims through art. So one of the programs we've been working on is the Pilgrims Meet the Arts. Because some of the paintings and other things that we're trying to tell the Pilgrim story are a little bit inaccurate. And some of our wonderful stories have never been told. Now, as mentioned, I am descendant from James Chilton. Now, James Chilton was the oldest passenger on the Mayflower. And I kind of wondered when I discovered this, what was a man 64 doing on the Mayflower? Now, it turns out James Chilton was one of the Separatists. He and his family were living, he was originally from Canterbury. He was a tailor, a fairly successful tailor. They had moved to Sandwich, and the town of Sandwich at St. Peter's Parish Church had a number of separatist leaning, And they got in trouble with the bishops because Mrs. Chilton, we believe her name was Susanna, and some of the others, were asked to help in the burial of a child because the church, you had to wait a while. They needed help in the grieving, and so they helped them. Well, that upset the bishops. And King James had said to Separatists, you will conform to the Book of Common Prayer, or I will harry you out of the country, or worse. Well, the Chiltons married, Susanna was excommunicated. She was the only pilgrim actually excommunicated. So they were harried out of the country, and they joined the congregation in Leiden. One of the things that why James Chilton was a successful tailor and fairly well-to-do, had his own house and tailor shop. Actually, the Chiltons lived just down the street from Rembrandt. So they probably knew Rembrandt. I don't know whether they would have called him Remy because he was the same age. But in 1619, there was some religious controversy called the Armenian Affair. And James was on his way home from market one day, and there was a group of about 20 boys outside his house accusing him of being an Armenian, which he wasn't. An Armenian has to do with Jacobus Arminius, who was a religious leader, not anything to do with the country of Armenia. And he was hit in the head with a rock, and that convinced him and most of the other members of the the Leiden Pilgrim congregation. They were no longer safe in Leiden. Now, one of the things to commemorate for the 400th anniversary was I actually commissioned a painting of James Chilton being hit in the head of the rock. So you can see this is in Leiden. And so one of the things that we can do is to look at some of the stories we have and then recreate, if they're been done but poorly done, encounters in art. So the pilgrim meets the art. The other painting, which is over here, is one of my fascinating stories. This is a painting, we call it Welcome Englishmen. And we commissioned this to be done, is the first encounter of the Pilgrims and the Native Americans. Now, as Judy pointed out, they arrived in what was Plymouth. Oh, by the way, a lot of people misunderstand why the name Plymouth was applied to Plymouth Plantation. They think because the Mayflower actually sailed from Plymouth, it was because that's where they came from. No, there's a really good reason why they chose Plymouth. Because the area was mapped by John Smith. And there was a notation of this village. And when John Smith showed the map to the Prince of Wales, who was later to become Charles I, the son of the king, he decided to call the place Plymouth, New Plymouth. So why did they choose it? Because everybody would know where they were. It was already on the map. So, another little bit of trivia. But anyway, they had been living and building their houses and creating their... They knew natives were around. They had heard them, but not seen them. They had some encounters on Cape Cod, but no close encounters. On March 16th, 1621, they were out building, and a Native American walks into the village. His name was Samoset, and he boldly says, "Welcome, Englishmen," in English. And he tells them that he's from a tribe of Indians, which were Abenaki in what is now Maine, and that the place they were settling was called Patuxent. And there had been a plague, and everybody was dead, and nobody was going to prevent them from staying there. He spent the night with Stephen Hopkins, and he was kind of a spy or emissary for Massasoit, the Wampanoag chief. And so he checked them out, and then eventually there was the meeting between Massasoit and Governor Carver and leaders, and they developed the treaty. But we wanted to recreate this in art because I thought that was fascinating. There had been some paintings done or drawings where they typically had log cabins. One of the problems we have is some of the paintings have the Native Americans in what the artists conceived of what they knew about Indians. Well, there were Plains Indians, not woodland Indians. So one of the things that we can do as part of this celebration is to sort of recreate and create images of what the Pilgrims. One of the things that I'm involved in for the Mayflower Society is we've created what we call the Mayflower Guard. And that would be how were the Pilgrims armed in 1621? What did they have? Well, I've got a few examples here. We have the matchlock musket, and I don't have a piece of match, but it would be a cord they'd light on, and then everybody had a sword. We know what they had because in Mort's Relations, Judy referred to it as almost a day-by-day diary of the first year of the Pilgrims. It said 16 men went out exploring, every man with his sword, his musket, and his corselet, and that would have been the armor. I don't have the example of the armor that they wore, but they all would have been wearing plate armor because they learned from Jamestown that too many men were out with their muskets, but they weren't wearing armor, and they were killed by brass-tipped arrows of the Native Americans. And we know they had brass tips on some of their arrows. So in Jamestown in 1611, all musketeers and arms, you had to be armed with plate armor. And the Pilgrims were paying attention to the lessons from Jamestown. So everyone had his own armor.
What does Mayflower mean to you personally?
Well, you asked what the Mayflower means to me. Growing up, I did not know that I was descendant from a Mayflower passenger. But when I discovered that, it opened up a whole new perspective on history. Because in fact, now major portions of American history turns out is my history. So that what we learned in school and other things about the Pilgrims now took on a whole nother meaning. So as I've traveled to some of the sites where my ancestors grew up, to walk the streets of Leiden, to be on the street where James Chilton lived and where that incident occurred, to be in Sandwich and other places, brings a whole richness to my understanding of now is my personal history, but American history. So one of the advantages that Judy and I and others share, we are American history.
Mayflower means to me, one, an understanding of people. It's a great place to do history that I believe where we don't mind telling, yes, the Pilgrims did things wrong. I love the people, and you have to realize most of them are my cousins, all 1,472. But it is an amazing organization. I think we all want to strive for the same goals.
The startling impact of discovering that the Native Americans spoke English.
Yeah, when I first read that passage out of Mort's Relations, of that first encounter, I was just blown away to say, "Welcome, Englishmen, and can I have a beer?" Goes, whoa. And so it was probably everybody was. In fact, one of the reasons that we commissioned this painting to be done is because that story is so interesting. Why it had been done in the past, but things were wrong, like log cabins and Samoset dressed as a Plains Indian and other things was, you have to get it right. But it's a fascinating introductory story that is so amazing.
One of the things that I recently learned just has to do with the respect, but also, as I told you earlier in mine, I love to know what they were thinking, how they interact and react with people. And they were truly fearful of each other. I mean, they were truly fearful. The Pilgrims, all they had based upon was Jamestown and a few of the other little, I'm blank on his name right now, Champagne, who had been, and so for him to come, that story, just being willing to come into the camp, then being willing to say that, is incredible. One of the most interesting things, the English didn't believe in bathing. The Native Americans were bathed often. So, they probably were wondering, where are those people bathing?
Yeah, I think the circumstances, particularly the fact that there had been this plague that weakened, and it's interesting because the Wampanoag were affected by the plague, but their neighbors, the Narragansett, were not. And that made the Wampanoag in a... because there were only about 150 Wampanoag. So the Wampanoag were able to survive because of the relationship they had to the Pilgrims, and the Pilgrims were able to survive because of the relation. That symbiotic relationship was so important to both. Now, later, with the huge influx of English, that really strained the boundaries of the Native American relationship. But that's another story. There's a lot of discussion sometimes of what did they have at the first Thanksgiving or celebration. And really when we talk about Thanksgiving, as we now know it, there are three primary traditions that have come together to form our American Thanksgiving. There is the tradition that the passengers who had lived in Leiden brought with them, and that is the celebration of the Relief of Leiden, which occurred in 1574. It was a siege by the Spanish that lasted 6 months, and nearly half of the population in Leiden died. In order to get rid of the Spanish, they broke the dikes, flooded the area, and sea beggars or pirates sailed up to the walls of Leiden and brought fish and bread. And so every October 3rd And to this day, they have this Relief of Leiden. And so that tradition was well known to the folk who came from Leiden. The other tradition that forms is the harvest festival that often occurred, particularly in England. And so the what we call the strangers, those who were not part of the guard, would have had that English tradition. And the third tradition, which is often overlooked, but are the feasting traditions of the Native Americans. And so they would have different festivals or feasts at different times, or when they had special visitors. So when the Pilgrims were starting their celebration, they were exercising their arms. Massasoit had heard the peace treaty, and they got, oh, something's going on. Maybe they're under attack. So he brought 90 of his warriors. When they found out that they're having a feast and special, we're happy to join in. And so then they had to go out and contribute. And so you can imagine, as Judy was talking about the 5 women and the 4 teenage young women having to prepare a feast for 150 people was quite a feat. So there's a lot of the fascinating stories that we have of our individual ancestors that make story. One of the things that I'm very proud of is James Chilton came over with his wife and his teenage daughter, Mary Chilton. Now, I'm descendant through James's oldest daughter, Isabella, and she and her family did not come over until 1630. But Mary, at 13, was given the honor to be the first person to step ashore. So my 9th great aunt, Mary Chilton, was the first one to step on Plymouth Rock. Now, there are other people who say, well, there's no evidence of that, and so, but if you're a Chilton, it's fact. And the legend has been around since 1721. So we Chiltons take pride that Mary was the first one on Plymouth Rock. Now, other Mayflower descendants go, oh, no, that's not a story. But there are some stories that are passed down amongst our ancestor families that make for interesting telling. And so it's always interesting to explore those stories. And it's, I think, incumbent on us who are descendants to help tell the story of the Mayflower and the Mayflower passengers, because it's really such an important element in our history. We were talking about some of the fascinating characters that were on the Mayflower. Judy mentioned Stephen Hopkins. He's an interesting individual. He was the only Mayflower passenger who had actually been to the New World. He had left his family behind in 1609 and went out on a resupply mission to the Jamestown colony. And the ship he was on was the Sea Venture. It was actually a purpose-built ship to carry passengers, but they were involved in a great hurricane, and they were shipwrecked on the island of Bermuda. And Bermuda was a deserted island, but mariners had been taught to avoid that, as they called the Isle of Devils. But they found when they got there, there were wild pigs that had been left by Spanish that flourished, and there was plenty to eat, fish, other things. And so eventually they rebuilt or built 2 ships to take them to Jamestown. And Stephen Hopkins he was kind of involved in a little bit of a mutiny, but managed to, because some of the people really wanted to stay on Bermuda. Life was good in Bermuda, as it is today. And eventually went to Jamestown and then came back to England. Some say he was on the same ship that John Rolfe and Pocahontas were on when they went to visit England. But I think it's time to move to questions, is it not?
The first question is, could you elaborate how the Pilgrims on the Mayflower had, because of their religious convictions, were motivated to live in harmony with the Native Americans? And can you describe that relationship, at least the first 20 to 40 years?
Well, one of the things that the relationship between the Wampanoag tribe and the Pilgrims was one of mutuality. One of the things that had happened 4 years before the Mayflower arrived, there had been quite an extensive plague that really decimated. It took out all the people living in the village of Patuxent, where Plymouth is today. And so the Wampanoag were severely, somewhat decimated. And they were under threat from particularly the Narragansett tribe that were threatening them. And Massasoit figured out that if he worked in harmony with these new arrivals, that their tribe could survive and thrive, which it did. For the Pilgrims, obviously having friends and your neighbors to help mutual defense was beneficial. And one of the things that the harmony, when the Pilgrims arrived, one, they didn't have much food, and the crops that could grow in Plymouth were not necessarily the peas and barley that they had brought with them, but the corn and the beans and other. So the Native Americans were able to teach these new Englishmen how to use the crops that would thrive and grow to survive. So that relationship was very strong and lasted for 50 years.
One of the most exciting things about the 400th, because it is truly a study of 4 different nations: the English, the Dutch, the Wampanoag Nation, and the American. And there is such a cultural blending, but it came because they learned to understand one another, and I think it's a good lesson for us to learn today.
Have you read recently the book published about Stephen Hopkins, A Stranger Among Saints, by Jonathan Mark? And that's by Carol. Could you comment on that book?
I've not read that. I've read another book about Stephen Hopkins by Caleb Johnson.
I've not read it, but I will, because he's one of my favorites.
Yeah, he's a fascinating character
person.
Because in some ways he's one of the more interesting of the Pilgrims, because he wasn't one of the Separatists, but to go off and survive the shipwreck in Virginia, and then to live in Jamestown for a number of years.
Very integral with Massasoit.
Yeah. Well, one of the things we think is that he may very well have spoken some of the language, because in Virginia, in the Powhatan, where the language was Algonquin for both the Powhatan and Virginia, and there would have been some common language, and that would have helped. In addition to the fact that we had Squanto, and Squanto's story is also fascinating.
But I'll look into that book.
Yeah. So yeah.
We have another question. We have a number of questions here. Can you comment about Longfellow's accurately portrayal of the relationship of the courtship of Miles Standish? And since your ancestor rejected Miles Standish, I'm going to let Judy answer that one first.
It is a great story. There's not particularly any proof behind that. But of course, if you're related to Longfellow and Pricilla Mullins and John Alden, it's a wonderful story. And it raised them to be one of the most well-known and popular pilgrims that there are.
Captain Battles?
Yeah, I think there's probably a kernel of truth in there. And I've speculated that probably some of it was true. And I think that John and Pricilla had a relationship that started on the voyage, and one of the reasons that John Alden might wanted to stay in Plymouth was because of Pricilla.
We just came up with this great plan.
Yeah, and so I'm sure that the story might have gotten some traction amongst the Aldens, because probably Pricilla would teach her children to tease her husband about that.
John Alden was a cooper.
The cooper. He was
on the ship.
Yeah.
So he wasn't part of the group, but he did sign the compact, and that told us he must have made his decision up pretty early on that voyage that he was not going back with the ship.
You could speculate that's because he met Pricilla.
Yeah, so.
Your ancestors both died, and then Pricilla was left orphaned even though she was 19. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
It was a terrible winter. Mullins was a shoemaker, and he, on the ship, which I did not use, bless his heart, one of the clippings in my story, when he brought on the ship with the 102 and the 2 dogs in this small space on the center court of the ship, he brought 80 pairs of shoes. So, but it was just so hard, and they had, she had siblings back in
She had
Joseph and
Joseph
died.
Joseph was with them. The Mullins had Pricilla and Joseph, and back in Dorking, she had an older sister, Sarah, and an older brother, William.
So she had a choice to go back, should she want to, but she chose not to.
Right. What's interesting, because Pricilla lost her entire family. Of the 4 teenage girls that we talked about, Mary Chilton, Elizabeth Tilley, Pricilla Mullins, and Constance Hopkins, 3 of those young girls lost their entire family. So can you imagine being 13, 14 years old in a new world, and you've lost your entire family, and there you are? What are you going to do? Now, what's impressive about those 4 teenage girls, I kind of like to talk about them as our 4 mothers, because they not only survived, they really thrived. Between those 4 young girls, they had 288 grandchildren. That's why they're really the 4 mothers of our country. That's why there's so many descendants.
Pricilla did have 11 kids of her own.
Well, they all had 10,
they had
9,
great
10.
families.
They had
It was
big
just,
families.
That's why today they believe there's close to 30 million ancestors So, Descendants, I mean, so.
Well, I studied a little bit about some Longfellow scholars that have researched his works and diaries and so forth, and there's certainly some evidence to support the Miles Standish story. Now, how much of it is resulting from his fictional imagination is unknown, but there's certainly, well, and she had to have had a certain amount of self-esteem to be able to tell the captain of the military, "No, I'm not interested in you."
Perhaps. I just sort of feel like we've been talking about this. It's funny, good question, but John probably had his eyes set on Pricilla from the get-go, because actually Standish was still married until after the thing. Rose didn't
She died in February, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, Rose.
She died pretty soon after they got here.
Well, after the
that's
first
where
winter.
the big death occurred because you had a few deaths.
That was February and March, most of the women
in
died.
December, when they were off Cape Cod. You had Dorothy Bradford, James Chilton, my ancestor, and one of the servants of William White. So there were.
Yeah, we went over that in the thing.
Yeah.
So it was, back to your original question, I think it's a great story. I just don't know of any actual truth, but I think they had a thing before Standish came along.
Okay, one of the questions, what foods were served at the first harvest feast?
Well, we know that there was fowl because Governor Bradford sent 4 men out fowling, and they brought enough fowl to feed the company for a week. Now, what would that fowl would have been? Would have been mallard duck, geese, our typical Canadian type geese, turkey, the wild turkey, and one thing that they most likely would have had that we don't talk much about was black swan. Now, black swan was fairly common, and it was highly prized both by the Native Americans and obviously the Native. And of course, we completely wiped out the black swan population, so it's extinct. And then, of course, you have the 5 deer that won't. And so then you would have had a number of.
Those are deer brought by the Indians.
Yeah, they brought the 5 deer, and so you would have been you would have had your various fowl. They would have also had fish, herring, clams. May have had lobster, but they would have definitely had fish. That would have been consistent with sort of their celebration from Leiden because it was fish, and then a number of side dishes. One of them most likely would have been succotash. Now we know the succotash today is corn and lima beans, but it would have been beans and would have been the corn would have been hominy because you couldn't eat native Indian corn was very hard. You had to either grind it into wheat or you turned it into hominy, and it's kind of interesting because I was looking at how did they make hominy, because usually hominy is made with lye. What would they have used? They would have used hardwood ash, so they might have had a version of clam chowder and lots of the squash. They would have had pumpkin. It wouldn't have been pumpkin pie as we know it, but it would have been boiled and mashed as a kind of a pumpkin stew. They might have probably the Pilgrims would have probably added some nutmeg. They would have also used, which was new to them, would be maple syrup. That was unknown to the obviously the English. But
the research that Plymouth Plantation has done said they only had 5 spices,
right.
And they would clean out the pumpkins. it would be made into a custard sort of thing, put back in. But you have to remember they didn't have flour, they didn't have sugar, so no bread, no ovens that first Thanksgiving or whatever you want to call it. And we know for a fact, which is often mispainted, is they didn't have anything with potatoes or apples, because they weren't even introduced into America until 1623. So
they would have also had cranberries and blueberries that they would have.
I thought it was wonderful when they said they had lobster when I visited Plymouth, because that's all I do when I go to New England is eat lobster. But then as we were leaving, when the lady said to us, but they didn't have drawn butter. I said, oh yeah.
Another question is, were there slaves on the Mayflower or Plymouth Colony?
No.
There were indentured servants, and those were people that might not have had their money to buy their way over. They might have owed a debt, but those people were generally had a certain time to work off their debt. But it all took hard work, so nobody got away free. But they were also, indentured servants were also allotted the land through the Plymouth records.
How many descendants of the Mayflower are in Texas?
I can't tell you how many are in Texas for sure. I can tell you how many are in the Texas Society, which we have in our society 1,472, and we have 453 juniors. Juniors is a big thing to us. I mean, education is so important.
How many Mayflower descendants are in America today?
They're estimating over 30,000.
30 million. Yeah.
I mean, I'm sorry.
30 million.
30 million.
Yeah. There are about 30,000 in the General Society of Mayflower Descendants. So we have a lot of recruiting because there's a lot of people out there that should be in the Mayflower Society.
I find the relationship between the Native Americans and the Pilgrims, the first 40 years, quite fascinating, and it's a lesson for all of us today.
It is. And it was 40 years of peace for them, and that says something. That was good for both of those. Both parts were working in harmony. Then it kind of fizzled out with the next generation of both parts. So
I think one of the things that maybe is an opportunity at this 400th commemoration is for us all to look at some of the traditions we have and particularly maybe take a different look at the Native American experience, because so much of what we are as a nation we owe to the first Americans, the Native Americans. And of course, one could claim they are immigrants too because they came in through Siberia, but that was a very, very long time ago. And I think can be an opportunity to look at that relationship.
Judy?
I hope, the story of the 400, the story of the beginning, it's so powerful to us, and I would like that message to get to everybody today. Harmony and understanding is really important.
We have just about a minute left. Could you tell why this is a 400th commemoration and not a 400th celebration?
Yes. It's not a celebration to all. To the Wampanoags, it was not a celebration. we're all working together to bring it culturally better. He says it better than I do.
Yeah, I think the word commemoration is appropriate rather than celebration, because we're commemorating the event. Because to some, well, it's like for some Native Americans, the Thanksgiving feast that we have is a day of mourning, but it's to commemorate a very important event that occurred that had a profound impact on the shaping of this nation as to what we are today.
And
with all the good
this
points and bad points.
commemoration, like I said earlier, is an understanding of all the cultures.
Yeah.
That's so fun.
Thank y'all so much.